Welcome to Intangibles, a podcast about traits, behaviors, and qualities that entrepreneurs can cultivate to help be successful. I'm your host, Steve BERG. I'm a partner at a New York City-based venture capital fund called Lytical Ventures. Lytical Ventures focuses on early-stage investments of companies that drive corporate intelligence. Corporate intelligence includes, for example, cybersecurity, data and analytics, and artificial intelligence. You can find us at www.lyticalventures.com. Lytical is spelled Lytical, Ventures, all one word, .com. This season is brought to you by Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, the Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. We have a new production partner this season, VC Careers. If you're looking for a job in venture capital, join over 8,000 VCs and VC job hunters on John Gannon's VC Jobs email list. Visit johngannonblog.com/intangibles to learn more and to subscribe. Also, please find Intangibles on its new home on the web, www.intangiblespodcast.com. Heroism is endurance for one more moment. It's telling that George Keenan, the man who uttered this sentence, was not an ultramarathoner or a chess grandmaster or even a competitive eater. He was an American diplomat. So besides assigning the proper value to endurance, he shows us the breadth of people to which endurance is important. My guest today is Alex Hutchinson, an author and journalist. He's an expert on the science of endurance and fitness. He's a contributing editor for Outside and also writes for The Globe and Mail and Canadian Running Magazine. He was a Runner's World columnist from 2012 to 2017. His third book, published in February of this year, is an exploration of the science and mysteries of endurance. It's called Endure, Mind, Body, and the Curiously Elastic Limits of Human Performance. He started out as a physicist with a PhD from the University of Cambridge, then a few years as a postdoctorate researcher with the U.S. National Security Agency, working on quantum computing and nanomechanics. During that time, he competed as a middle and long-distance runner for the Canadian national team, mostly as a miler, but also dabbling in cross-country and even a bit of mountain running. So it's fair to say he knows a thing or two about endurance. Hi, Alex. Welcome to Intangibles.
Hey, Steve. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Endure is a pretty thick book with a bunch of research in it. Let's try to break it down a little bit. Usually a definition is a good place to start. Can you define for us endurance?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there are lots of ways to define it, but the one I ended up settling on, which is borrowing from some of the research in this area, is that endurance is the struggle to continue against a mounting desire to stop. So it's something that's very general in our ability to deal with sustained challenge. It's not just running a marathon.
But there's a spectrum of activities in which endurance plays a part, from purely cognitive activities on one end to purely physical activities on the other. Is there a way to break down the difference we struggle against at different points on this spectrum? For example, what does endurance look like to an elite chess player versus an elite marathon runner?
Yeah, for sure. That's a perfect example of obviously, chess players aren't worried about the glycogen levels in their legs or their breathing rate, and so the cognitive versus physical spectrum is one way of looking at it. But another way of looking at it that I kind of came away with after thinking about this for a long time is that it's more a hierarchical thing, that it's not cognitive on one end and physical on the other hand, but it's more like cognitive endurance, I think, is the kind of highest point on the hierarchy, that everyone, whether you're a marathon runner or a chess player, is facing the cognitive challenge of continuing to, struggling to continue against a mounting desire to stop. Now, what is it that you have this desire to stop? A marathon runner wants to slow down their pace and not let their heart rate come down. A chess player wants to let their mind wander and stop doing the sort of incessant calculation of possibilities and probabilities. But fundamentally, each of them are each person is trying to hold their finger in the candle flame for a little bit longer and force themselves to keep doing that. So I think I would say the fundamental aspect of endurance, that at least my impression, is the cognitive aspect, and the physical is a sort of subdomain. That's the thing you're struggling against cognitively if you're running a marathon. But the cognitive thing overlaps between the chess player and the marathon runner in this example.
That's I think the crux of this thing is right there. There's a quote in the book which is that physiologists have found that the will to endure can't be reliably tied to any single physiological variable, meaning the distinction between physical and physiological is less clear-cut than it actually appears. So, that is implying to me that a good chunk of it is mental. How do we make that quote in the book make sense based on the prior answer you gave about the spectrum?
Yeah, so I would say, so this has been, let me, as you said in the intro, I started out as a runner, right? And so my interest in this topic came from my experiences pushing my limits in running. And so I started out with the assumption that I wanted to understand what was holding me back when I raced, and what, and of course, implicitly what I could do to change those limits. So I wanted to find out, is it my legs that are holding me back? Is it the lactate in my legs? Is it my ability to get oxygen to my muscles? Is it my lungs? Is it my heart? Which of these measurable physiological things is holding me back when I run a race? I wasn't totally naive. I knew it was going to be complicated, and there's not just one thing, and I expected it to be a combination of all these things. But what you find, or what physiologists have found, is that, yes, you can study all these aspects of the body, but none of them quite explain. And some people, if you have a stronger heart and bigger blood vessels and more efficient muscles, you're going to be a better runner than someone who doesn't have those traits. But when it comes right down to what defines the limits of your performance, what dictates the moment where you slow down or give up, it's impossible to tie that decision making to any of these physiological parameters. And like you said, I think that gets at this idea that actually when push comes to shove, the limits of your endurance are not defined by lactate levels or heart rate. And there must be something else behind the curtains that's making those decisions. And I think sort of the argument that I make in the book, and that scientists have been, or physiologists have been building towards over the last few decades, is that ultimately it's a cognitive decision. It's the mind that is, again, behind the curtains, making the actual decision. So I think that's the reason we can't find the single physiological variable that, it's the heart rate or it's the lactate, is because it's not. It's the mind that ultimately decides when you've pushed as far as you're going to push.
Well, I think that's a great answer, because, whether or not you are trying to spend 19 consecutive hours coding, or you're, working on a deadline for a book, or, training for a marathon, all of those things are, for the most part, in your head, and you can accomplish them if you have that mental endurance. So I guess the obvious question is, what's the best way to boost mental endurance?
Yeah, that's the very big question. The one thing I can say is the answer is not just decide that you're going to do it. I mean, that's important. It's important to decide you're going to do it. But it's not all in your head, in the sense that you can just, if I just decide I'd really like to win an Olympic gold medal, so I'm going to try really hard, and therefore I'm going to be able to do it. What you get out of the idea that the limits are obvious, are ultimately dictated in the mind, isn't that they're just imaginary and you can change them at will, but it's that they're negotiable, that they're not limits that feel kind of absolute and firm can be pushed a little bit, and they're subject to your your mindset and things like that, which we can get into more later. But in terms of the single best way to boost mental endurance, I think is to endure, to go through it on a regular basis. It's something that gets better with practice. And there's some specific ways that you can, there's some specific techniques, which we can get to, things like self-talk, where you can kind of specifically push the mental aspect of endurance. But really the fundamental thing is, you need to be pushing yourself, pushing your limits, experiencing discomfort on a regular basis. And if you do that, you're going to get better in the same way that your muscles get stronger when you push them on a regular basis.
Sure. Boost mental endurance by practicing mental endurance. I got it. Let's talk about pain and effort. To me, they feel like they should be opposing forces. Pain making you want to stop, and effort driving you to continue. But they're not. Let's define them and try and put them into context with endurance. For the purpose of our discussion now, let's define pain.
Yeah, so that's a tricky one. And what I would say, or I think what pain researchers would say, is that one thing pain isn't is like just a little dial in your head that responds to, you prick yourself with a needle, and that's a 6 out of 10 on pain or whatever. It's a fundamentally subjective experience, and some of the researchers I spoke to, they'd say it's not just it's a sensation, but it's also an emotion. It's a drive state that compels action. Just like hunger makes you go and find food, pain makes you pull your hand away, or try and make whatever is hurting you stop. So pain, even though it's hard to define, I think we have a pretty good sense of subjectively that it's an unpleasant sensation, but it's different than effort in the sense that effort is the feeling that something is hard. Pain is the feeling that something hurts. So you can be, you can be experiencing some, like if I put my hand in a bucket of ice, which is a classic pain test, that will hurt pretty soon. It's not, I don't have it. It doesn't take a lot of effort to put my hand in the ice. It's just painful. But conversely, there are some things that are very hard to do, like say juggling, which take a lot of effort and concentration, but they don't hurt. And so it's clear to understand that some things are just difficult to keep doing, even if they don't hurt. And what's confusing is that there are activities that mix both. And when running a marathon takes a lot of effort and a lot of pain. And we tend to sort of conflate those two things so that you say, I had to slow down or running a 10K, say, I had to slow down late in that 10K because it hurt too much. But what you find if you actually do studies, and researchers have done studies where they try and separate out pain and effort, they explain really clearly to the subjects what the difference is, and they ask them to rate their pain and their effort. And what they find is that in exercise tests, often it's painful. It might be a 6 out of 10 in pain by the time you get to the end of a 10K race, but it's a 10 out of 10 in effort. So what's holding you back really is effort, is that you've maxed out the effort you're able to give, not that it hurts too much. The pain is kind of a byproduct. So I think that's the idea that it's all about enduring pain is not quite right. It's also about being willing to exert your maximal effort.
But there is a such thing as pain threshold, right?
Yeah, for sure. And it is absolutely true. Even though I know I just said that pain is not the ultimate limiter, but pain is definitely a factor in dealing with things like when you're talking about physical endurance tests, like going back to the chess player versus the marathoner, chess is not, to my knowledge, painful, but for physical endurance tests, pain is real, and being able to handle or not let pain get in your head is a really important thing. And there's been a lot of studies comparing athletes to non-athletes. And what they find is that there's no magical adaptation that allows athletes not to feel pain. So if you round up a bunch of people and start giving them escalating electric shocks, the point at which they'll say, hey, that hurts, this now is classified as pain. That's the same for athletes and non-athletes. But well-trained athletes will be willing, that's their pain sensitivity. But their pain threshold, the point at which they say, that's too much, I can't take it anymore, stop, that's much higher in athletes than non-athletes. So they feel pain the same way, but they've learned techniques for living with this pain, or for being willing to tolerate it. They've learned to distract themselves. They've learned to reframe it in a way that is, less threatening. Instead of thinking, oh my God, it hurts, I'm going to die, I need to stop. They're thinking, okay, this pain means that I can't continue like this indefinitely. So I need to adjust my pace. It becomes neutral information rather than panic. So definitely, it's one of the things that people can get better at is learning to live with pain or deal with pain without letting it throw them off their game.
It's so interesting. I thought for sure you were going to say something about blocking it out, but you didn't say a thing about that. It's about the comfort level with acknowledged pain.
That's a great point. And actually one of the sort of fascinating studies that I came across in looking into this, there's some great studies where researchers will inject a nerve block into the spine of subjects, and it's a one-way nerve block. So they're able to use their legs as normal, but they don't feel any pain from their legs. So and then they put them on an exercise bike and say, okay, let's do a time trial and see how fast you can ride, say, 5K. And so this sounds like the ultimate athletic dream, right? You can push as hard as you want and you will feel no pain. And it seems like that when they start out this time trial, they start out really fast because they feel like $1 million. But what you find is partway through, their pace starts to drop. And by the end, they're going so slow that they don't get any advantage from not being able to feel pain because they've pushed too hard at the beginning. They've pushed their muscles to the point that their muscles aren't working properly anymore. So without the sensation of pain, they're not able to pace themselves. So the pain for athletes is a really valuable source of information. It's not a pleasant source of information, but if you're trying to ride right to the edge of your limits, you need that pain to tell you how close you are to make sure you don't step over the edge of the cliff.
Yeah, so there's multiple systems at work, right? There's the mental system, which you're saying you can kind of fudge with, and then there's a physical system that almost is like a check and balance on the mental system.
Yeah, so I think one of the big themes that I came across in the book, and I looked at a lot of different sort of putative limits, like does oxygen, is that the ultimate limit, or is it pain, or is it heat, or is it thirst? And wherever you look, what you find is we have some very powerful warning signals that hold us back before we get to an absolute concrete limit. So that we have a lot of orange lights before we get to the red light, and most of us stop when we hit the orange light. But that doesn't mean there aren't red lights. There are, of course, there are physical limits. And so when you take away the pain signal, what you find is you push a little farther, but then you run into those red lights, and running into the actual limits is much more serious and really hurts your performance. So you do better, somewhere between the initial warning signal and the stop sign. You want to be in that kind of gray zone.
Right. So just a moment more on pain threshold. I'm curious, you mentioned something about athletes. Is pain threshold a God-given gift? Like there's this great German cyclist, Jens Voigt, and he was a climber, and he just had a constitution that seemed like it was off the charts. I'm wondering if he just was like gifted, or in fact, do people learn to tolerate more pain via the repetition and practice like you were kind of alluding to?
Yeah, I think I'll give the classic scientific answer, which is that I think it's all of the above. For sure, I think there are, like there is in any human trait, there are variations, and there's there's probably some people who, for whatever reason, kind of don't mind or even seek out the sensation of discomfort more than others. But there's indisputable evidence that people get better at handling pain with exposure to pain. And so in fact, even the type of training you do makes a difference. The more high intensity training you do that forces you to experience quite high levels of discomfort, intermittently, the greater your pain threshold increases. And for someone like Jens Voigt, I think it also becomes a question of personal mythology, that he woke up every morning and told himself, I'm more willing to suffer than everyone else. That became his brand. He trademarked the phrase "shut up legs" because that was his response to the feeling of discomfort in races. And so that informed his mindset that when he's in a pack, in a breakaway pack, and everyone is suffering, the thoughts going through his mind aren't, oh, this hurts so much. The thoughts are going through, yes, everyone is suffering. And since I love suffering more than everyone else, that means I'm going to do well today. So I think it becomes a sort of a self-reinforcing and performance-enhancing story to tell yourself. But I think there's also some truth to it that he probably started with a high pain threshold and developed it deliberately over the course of time, learned to embrace that kind of suffering.
The other guy that comes to mind is Steve Prefontaine, and I've used it before, but the quote that he has is, I don't run to see who's fastest, I run to see who's got the most guts. I wanted to ask, if you increase your tolerance to pain, your pain threshold via physical activity, is that potentially transferable to other non-physical activities? Like if I increase my pain threshold as a runner, does that mean I can translate that into concentration as a chess master?
So I'll give a qualified yes to that. For sure, it translates to non-physical activities. So if you increase your pain threshold as an athlete by doing cycling training, they've definitely shown that it changes your pain tolerance in all sorts of other tests, like dipping your hand in ice water. They do tourniquet tests where they squeeze a tourniquet around your arm. All these things that have nothing to do with exercise. And in fact, if you're a cyclist, your arms aren't doing anything at all, and yet your pain tolerance to pain, to pain being applied to your arm changes. Now, does it change your tolerance to or your ability to sort of stay focused, to resist mental discomfort? There is a little bit of evidence that is the case. There's been some studies with elite cyclists in Australia showing that their response inhibition is better. They're better able to stay focused on a task and suppress the other urges that are trying to take them away from that task. It's in these cases, like you were saying before, it's hard to tease out exactly, like, did these people become elite cyclists because they did have good response inhibition, good ability to tolerate discomfort, or did they get better at those things while training to become elite cyclists? We don't know the full answers, but there's definitely a link between your ability to tolerate physical discomfort and the people who are able to stay focused and resist mental fatigue or mental discomfort also.
So I started out this topic about pain and effort, and I think we've got pain down. Let's talk a little bit about the effort side. First of all, there's a scale that measures effort, isn't there?
Yeah, it goes back to the 1960s, developed by a guy named Borg. So if you hear someone talking about the Borg scale, that's an effort scale. And it's gone through various iterations. He started out with a scale that bizarrely goes from 6 to 20. And the idea is it's supposed to be roughly comparable to, you multiply it by 10 and that will be your heart rate. So if you're going 12 out of 20, then you'll be at a heart rate of 120. That's kind of hard for people to conceptualize. So often he uses a scale that goes from 1 to 10. Or researchers now often use a similar scale that goes from 1 to 10. And, 10 is like as hard as you can possibly imagine. And, 6 might be somewhat hard and so on like that. And what's really remarkable is this sounds like just the mushiest, most kind of, non-objective, non-repeatable measure you can imagine. But it's basically as accurate as anything you can do in the lab, things like lactate tests and, VO2 max measurements. Someone's subjective effort, if they've been properly informed what the different numbers correspond to, is as repeatable and as accurate at figuring out how hard they're working. You can use the Borg scale to really tell when someone is at their lactate threshold or when they're going to be able to sustain the exercise for 10 minutes more versus 20 minutes more. So what that effort scale is doing, it's a way of most of us don't go around saying, I feel like I'm working at a 7 out of 10 right now. But what the scale does is force you to quantify this sort of feeling you have in your head that is integrating all the information from your body and from your environment about how hard something feels and how hard you can contain it. So you've got this kind of supercomputer in your brain that's calculating every aspect, monitoring every sort of fuel gauge and temperature gauge in your body. And if you ask yourself, how hard am I going on a scale of 1 to 10, that supercomputer kind of spits out a number that's very, very accurate and sophisticated in telling you how hard you're going.
Okay, let me see if I understand this. So I think you're saying if your brain is tired, exercise actually feels harder. So All right. If you're mentally fatigued, your level of perceived exertion is actually greater than someone with exactly the same inputs that's not mentally fatigued. Is that right?
That's right. And I think that's maybe, in a sense, the most important thing you can possibly say about this whole topic, because it's interesting from a curiosity perspective to say, hey, did you know that your limits are in your head, not in your body? That's a novelty. But what does it mean when push comes to shove? What it means is that if it's not your lactate levels or your heart rate that dictates your limits, if it's your brain, then what it means is that everything else going on in your brain can have an impact on your performance. Because if what we're saying here is that the fundamental decision or the fundamental measurement that matters is your sense of effort, which you can quantify with this Borg scale we were just talking about. When your sense of effort gets to 10 out of 10, that's it. You're cooked. It doesn't matter what your core temperature is or how hydrated you are. What matters is when your effort gets to 10 out of 10. Now, if you're dehydrated or if you're overheated, those are factors that will push your effort up towards that critical 10 out of 10. But like you said, if you stayed up late last night, and didn't get enough sleep, or if you've spent the last 4 hours reading the tax code looking for an obscure loophole, something that takes a lot of concentration, that will change your mental fatigue, and that will in turn push up your effort level. And there's been some really elegant experiments showing this, that doing a little bit of brain work for 60 minutes or 90 minutes means that, and then if you do that and then you get on an exercise bike at a certain pace, your performance will be worse. And it'll be worse because when you get on that bike and start pedaling right from the start, 5 seconds into that pedaling, you'll be saying, this feels like a 6 out of 10. Whereas if you're mentally fresh, you'll be saying, this feels like a 5 out of 10. And that difference in your subjective effort is going to dictate how fast and how far you can go. And so understanding the role of mental fatigue, it's both a demonstration that the brain is really in control, but it is also a reminder to all of us that, boy, you have to take seriously your mental state and your state of mental freshness if you're trying to perform at your best.
I mean, I think that's really good news, because to me, what that's saying is that anything that alters your perception of effort can also alter your endurance.
That's absolutely. And that's so, and on the glass half empty side, you can say, yeah, that means if you have a really, long or stressful day at work, when you head to the gym, your performance is going to be worse, or whatever the case may be. Or you don't even have to take it to the gym. You can say, if you're, giving an important presentation, if you do that important presentation after a stressful week where you've been worried about everything else, you're not going to be as sharp. It's going to feel harder. Your performance is going to be impacted. But the glass half full side of that is, okay, but there are other things we can do that will reduce your perception of effort, that will allow you to perform better. And the classic ubiquitous example is caffeine. And there have been lots of arguments over the years how does caffeine enhance performance? And people argue about, does it make the muscles twitch more effectively? Does it change whether you're burning fat or carbohydrate? That the modern view, the most current view, is that caffeine is a ubiquitous performance enhancer and a universal one, because it changes your perception of effort. It changes the buildup of certain neurochemicals that affect your perception of effort. So what caffeine is doing is making a 6 out of 10 effort feel like a 5 out of 10, whether it's a physical effort or a mental effort. There are other things that can change your perception of effort. And one of my sort of favorite examples, it's because it's such a bizarre lab experiment, but it makes an important point. There's a study where they used subliminal images of either smiling faces or frowning faces, and they were flat. So cyclists were doing a test, and on the wall in front of them, they were flashing images for 16 milliseconds at a time. So that's like a tenth of a blink. So no one was aware that there were faces being flashed on the wall, and yet the cyclists who were showing smiling faces were able to last 12% longer in a time to exhaustion test than the ones who were showing frowning faces. So, and the idea here is that, on some unconscious level, seeing a smiling face, it kind of, when you see someone smile, it kind of evokes an involuntary smile in you. It evokes a sense of ease. and that means you're interpreting these signals from the rest of your body a little more favorably. Things just feel a little bit better because you have the sense that someone is smiling, and so you get this subtle boost in performance. And I don't think no one is advocating that we start flashing subliminal messages everywhere to enhance performance, but it's a reminder that there are lots of subtle things, whether it's in your internal monologue or in the people around you or in your environment, that can affect your perception of effort, and as a result, your performance.
So I want you to know, this past weekend was the Brooklyn Half, and having read the book, I knew this story about the smiley faces. And so it didn't happen as frequently as the book suggested ought to get the performance boost. But I had a couple of people along the way, and I asked them to make a sign where they literally just do a circle, 2 dots, and the equivalent of a smiley face. And when I came, just hold it up. And it wasn't the actual smiling face that was smiling at me that made the impact. It was me laughing about the joke of knowing that a smile boosts your endurance, and it made me smile at least a couple of times during the race. So you're already having an impact on running performance.
Well, if they were holding up those smiling faces for everyone going by, it may have caused a dramatic change in the results of the Brooklyn Half.
I think that's right.
But seriously, yeah, no, it's these things are subtle and hard to measure, but also just the knowledge of seeing a friend there, seeing someone supporting you, taking the trouble to be out there with a smiley face sign. I think that's something that can also give you a boost that is real and helpful.
So I got to ask. With pain and effort, knowing that they're not necessarily opposing forces, is one or the other have more impact on endurance?
Yeah, ultimately, I would say effort is the really key concept that you need to keep in mind for endurance. Pain matters for sure. If you're doing something and it hurts, that's gonna it's going to indirectly increase your level of effort. Things feel harder if you're in pain, but it's the effort that's the critical that hits that critical threshold and causes you to stop or slow down. So they both matter. It's not a simple one or the other, but the real concept that I think people need to think more about is how hard is it's the struggle to continue. How hard is this effort, not how much does it hurt?
I got to tell you, I'm totally shocked. I asked my wife the same question, and she's like, "Oh yeah, for sure, it's effort." And I was like, "What?" So
she's ahead of the curve.
Yeah, she's ahead of the curve. I would have guessed it. Okay, I'm gonna move us a little forward, and I want to talk about motivation and belief. I guess the first obvious question is, within the umbrella of endurance, what is a motivator? I think it's a little confusing to me because a motivator can presumably increase your effort level, but not lower your perception of effort. First of all, do I have that right? And then I guess the first question, what is a motivator? Yeah,
so you're right that when we talk about effort, we're really only talking about half the picture. And if you talk to scientists in this field, at least to some scientists, there's a lot of. I should clarify that this is an active area of research, and people have lots of different theories. And the work I'm talking about right now is developed by a researcher named Samuel Morcora, who's a researcher at the University of Kent in Britain. And he has a model called the psychobiological model that tries to understand the sort of psychological and biological influences on endurance. And in his model, it's kind of like the motivation and effort are kind of the yin and yang. Effort is how hard it feels, and motivation, your level of motivation for a given task, is what dictates how much effort you're willing to give. If you're doing something that's not very important to you, you might be willing to say, "I'm going to push. I'm willing." Under the hood, what's going on in your head is, "I'll go as hard as I can up to about 7 out of 10." And once it gets to 7 out of 10, it's no longer worth my while. This is like you're in gym class. The phys ed teacher tells you to run a mile as hard as you can, and you don't really care. You don't care about your mark in gym class. You're going to run pretty hard. But when it gets hard, it gets up to about 7, 8 out of 10. It feels pretty unpleasant. You're like, this is as hard as I'm willing to go on this day. Then you're in the Olympic final running the 1500, and you're willing to go to 10, 10 out of 10 absolute max. And the difference there is the effort of running at a given pace hasn't changed, but how much effort you're willing to output has changed. And the difference is motivation. And the same thing is, if you're running the Brooklyn half and you're running along and you feel like you're going as hard as you can, and then you see your friend yelling at you saying, you can do it. That guy up there is your arch nemesis. That guy you hate. He's 10 seconds in front of you. If you push, you can beat him. And when you go by, you can stick your tongue out at him. Again, you might have felt like you were going as hard as you could go, but if you've changed if you've changed your motivation, you're suddenly, instead of just thinking, I'm willing to go 9.3 out of 10, you're now willing to go 9.6 out of 10 because there's an incentive. So motivation can come in all sorts of forms. There can be, internal and external, and there are many reasons for doing things. But the stronger the motivation, that's what sets the cap on how high you're willing to push, or how much effort you're willing to put out for a given task.
So you're saying basically any way you can find to raise the stakes, that's going to increase your motivation. What in the example you just gave, you were talking about self-talk. I think we touched on it before. Let's try and talk a second on that. In your book, you mentioned that if you had any regret in high school, it was that you didn't take to heart what you were taught regarding self-talk, and that you didn't seek to learn more. So I think as a discussion on motivation, first of all, what was it that you were taught? And as an example, what should people be self-talking to themselves when they're running the Brooklyn half?
Yeah, so I ran track in college, and we had a sports psychologist working with us who taught us a number of techniques. The one that sticks in my mind is this negative thought stopping process. So basically recognizing when you have negative self-talk, and she taught us the 5 R's. So if you notice you're having a negative thought, you have to recognize it, then you refuse to let it affect you, then you relax, and then you reframe your mental state in a more positive way, then you resume your normal business. So we had this sort of recognize, refuse, relax, reframe, resume mantra that we were taught, which we all learned, but none of us took it seriously, and none of us really tried to apply it in any real way. Now, looking back, I realized that this is actually, there's been a bunch of research in the last few years showing how negative talk in this framework that I was just talking about of effort and motivation, self-talk can play a key role in the effort that you ascribe to a given level of physical output. So if you're running along at a given pace and someone asks you, how hard are you pushing? Well, if you're running along and in your head, you're thinking to yourself, oh, this is way too hard. I can't, it hurts so much. I hate this. Why do I even do this in the first place? This is pathetic. And someone says, how hard are you pushing? You're going to say, I'm pushing it, 8 out of 10. I'm 9 out of 10. It's just so hard. Whereas if you're telling yourself, you could do this, push through this, you're ready for this, you've done the training, keep going. You might be running at exactly the same pace, but someone will ask you, how hard are you pushing? And you'll say, oh, it's about 7 out of 10. I know I can do this. I know I can keep going for another, to the finish line. And so, again, I know it sounds kind of hokey, and to be honest, this is the reason I kind of dismissed it when I was in university, that it's like, it doesn't sound real. Like, it doesn't sound like VO2 max and lactate and all these things that are so measurable in the lab. It just sounds like a kind of sort of woo-woo, think positive thoughts and you'll be able to achieve. But there've been a bunch of studies lately showing that you teach people, you give people some very brief training in reframing their self-talk during time, periods of stress or periods of effort. And it actually changes the effort, their effort ratings for a given level of physical effort or physical output, and it allows them to push harder, to go faster, to keep going for longer. So what is the right self-talk? It depends. It varies from person to person. And the things that might inspire one person might make someone else be like, oh, that's so stupid. That's so cliched. That's so corny. So part of the process of motivational self-talk training is, first of all, you have to become aware of what you tell yourself. if you're running a 10K race or if you're giving an important presentation, what is going through your mind when you step to the podium or when you step at the start line? Are you saying, oh boy, here we go again, this is going to suck? So, and then you identify the things you say that are problematic, that are holding you back, and you come up with a list of possible replacements. And then you have to try them out in training, in practice, and figure out which ones kind of click and feel good to you and which ones just feel silly. Because let's be honest, a lot of the sort of motivational mantras that you might come up with for a lot of people are going to strike them as silly. So you find something that works for you, and then you have to practice it until it becomes second nature. So that, again, when you come to that moment of stress, when you step to the podium or when you step to the start line, it's automatic that instead of thinking, this sucks, you're thinking, I can do this, I'm ready for this.
So when you say I can do this, there's a really important piece of it that kind of goes unspoken, and that's that you have to be able to believe that you in fact can do this. There's a story, actually there's a number of stories in the book that illustrate kind of examples where coaches have illustrated to their athletes that they can do something that they didn't necessarily believe they could. And then that ultimately, once you have that in your head, when you say, I can do this, there's an underpinning. Maybe you could tell a couple of those stories from the book.
Yeah, I think that's a really important caveat you brought up. It's like, if you hypnotize me so that I fully believe that I'm going to set a world record at the marathon, I may have 100%, perfect self-talk and perfect belief, but I'm not going to set a world record in the marathon. Like, there has to be a connection between reality and your self-talk. So you have to be able to find reasons to believe that you can do what you're going to do. And so, I talked to a lot of scientists in this and researchers in this area, and I asked them, like, okay, you've got these great theories about the role of the brain. So how do we use this in training? What does this actually mean in practice? And I got one of the common answers I got from people was, listen, coaches have been doing this for a long time, and they've been finding ways of teaching this lesson. And so one of the scientists told me this story, this guy named Tim Noakes, who's a very prominent researcher in this area. He said, he learned this lesson from a rowing coach back in the early 70s. And they used to do a standard workout of, I think it was like 8 times a 500 meter section or something like that.
No, 5 times 500.
As hard as they could.
5 times 500.
500. Okay, so they do a certain number of intervals. It's their standard workout. And then one time they finished their workout, and of course they're exhausted. They've pushed as hard as they could, and they're lying there on the ground. And the coach says, "Okay, do another one, or do another 4, or whatever the case may be, at the same pace." And the athlete's like, "There's no way. We just went as hard as we could." But they trust the coach. They go back. They try, and they realize, oh, they can do one more. And so the upshot, according to Noakes, is that that's the point where you learn that you're capable of more than you think, and that's kind of a really crucial lesson to keep in mind. But you can't just tell someone. It's like, well, I mean, you can, but it's powerful to experience that lesson rather than just have someone say, you can do it. Go out there and do it. It's like you learn. Someone teaches you can do it. So I think that's. Your self-talk has to be connected to reality, and you have to go through the process of earning that belief so that when you're in the heat of the moment, you can trust what you're telling yourself.
So I imagine you're too modest to tell the story, but I'm going to tell people that they need to get the book and they need to find the story about your high school 1,500 meter time. And the notion of being at a plateau, going into a race that you didn't necessarily think was made for you to push beyond, and then being able to somehow find it. So I'm going to add that as a story in and tell people to go find it. On the belief, kind of, if there's a belief coin, a heads and a tails of belief coin, I want to talk about the tail side for a second. There's this persistent myth that once Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile barrier, that changed people's belief that it could be done. Like heretofore, we'll never do it. All of a sudden he does it, and then everyone started to do it. And kind of conventional wisdom was, They saw someone do it, they knew it could be done, and therefore that mental barrier was removed for them. But I'm not entirely sure that is in fact the case. What's your take on the Roger Bannister 4-minute mile?
Yeah, I love the story of the 4-minute mile, and like all great stories, it has gotten inflated in the telling over the years. When I was looking through this, some books that reference it, and you find these claims. There's one book I found that makes the claim that 300 people, after Bannister broke the 4-minute mile, 300 people broke it within the next year. And that's just, utterly fictitious. That's not what happened. In fact, 4 people broke it within the next 12 months after Bannister. So 4 people is a lot less than 300, but it's still a pretty substantial number when you consider no one had broken the 4-minute mile in history. And then all of a sudden, within 1 year, 4 people do it. So it gives you a sense that it wasn't just a mental barrier that, as soon as Bannister did it, everyone else could do it. But there was something there. There was something about Bannister doing it that told other people that it was possible, that encouraged other people to go out and run the first half mile in 2 minutes. That they say, if he can do it, and if I want to be the best in the world, I'm going to have to do it too. So people started trying to do it, and some of them found that they could do it. So I think, ultimately the hardest part of running a 4-minute mile is getting in the physical shape to run a 4-minute mile. And I say that as someone who's ultimately my best 1500 time, according to the conversion tables, works out to a mile in about 4 flat 0.02 or something like that. So I'm someone who tried very hard to run a 4-minute mile and didn't do it. And, again, the real challenge is getting in the physical shape. But once you get to that point, when you're knocking on the door, there's also this mental component. And I think there's some reality to that idea that the first person through a barrier knocks it down a little bit and makes it a little easier for others to follow through afterwards.
Okay, so it's not a full-on refute of the notion. It's just that there's a bunch of components, and let's not just, like you were saying earlier, all of a sudden believe that you can do the marathon without training and expect that can happen.
Yeah, it's just all about context and keeping things in proportion, and that, like you said, that applies to all the stuff we're talking about. It's like understanding the role of the brain, I think, is really important and interesting. If you want to translate it to a business context, it's like, self-belief and mental persistence, all these things are really important, but you still have to do the fundamentals. You still have to have actually, the financials have to work, or whatever the case may be. So we're talking about the stuff on the margins, the sort of the 1%, not the 99%. And that stuff only matters if you've already taken care of the 99%.
Right. Okay, this is a little bit of a transition here, but I want to talk about mindfulness because it's in the book. To some of the podcast listeners, this is going to sound like a broken record, but a bunch of people have come onto the podcast to presumably talk about some other intangible, but then mindfulness comes up as a component of that trait. What is the value of mindfulness as it relates to endurance?
Yeah, and I will say as a start, like I'm almost like hesitant to ever bring up mindfulness because it's so buzzy right now. It's so such a widely used and maybe overused concept. But I have to go where the research follows me, and there's just some fascinating research about the links between mindfulness and endurance. And particularly, there's a lab at UC San Diego where they've been doing a bunch of brain scanning with elite performers, people like Navy SEALs and elite adventure racers and things like that, and looking at how they basically resilience, how they deal with adversity. And one of the tests they use is this amazing protocol where they put people in a brain scanner. So you're lying in this big this big magnet tube. And you're lying there motionless, but you have to you're tapping your fingers to do these cognitive tests on a computer, and you're basically breathing through this mask where every once in a while they, without warning, restrict the flow of oxygen. So it's you can still breathe, but it's like you're breathing through a straw. It's very stressful to be in this magnet, breathing through a straw, trying to do these cognitive tests. And the amazing thing is what they found is most people, of course, you restrict their breathing and they kind of panic a little bit and they start doing worse on the cognitive tests. The elite performers, the Navy SEALs and the elite athletes, It's actually the opposite. When they are suddenly breathing through a straw, their performance on the cognitive testing doesn't get worse, and in fact, in some cases, it gets better. They go into a heightened state of performing well under stress, and this is kind of the trait we all want. We all want to be able to deal with, to respond well when the chips are down and when things get stressful, to get better rather than worse, and they were able to pick up some distinct brain signatures about how the way people monitor the signals from their body, which brain areas are active when, and showing that normal people tend to kind of overreact when there's a negative stimulus. They're kind of over responding to that stimulus. And so the question they wanted to ask is, how can we make the rest of us more like these elite performers? And one of the things they tried, which turned out to be successful, was an 8-week mindfulness course. They taught people. They used the standard 8-week mindfulness course, and then they adapted it a little bit to have specific tests that focused for special forces people or for athletes. And they found that their brain scanning results and their response to stress got more like the elite performers after the mindfulness training. And it kind of makes sense, because what we're talking about here is the ability to handle negative input and not overreact to it. It's kind of a non-judgmental awareness of the outside world, which is exactly what mindfulness is about. So, I think it's interesting. I think it has some potential to help with exactly the kinds of challenges we've been talking about.
Yeah, I agree. People are kind of laying it out there as a panacea, and there are definitely some. You should be mindful of the limitations of it, but broadly, it is your mind kind of working within the systems of your body, right? Whether it's breathing, whether it's mental, whether it's all the things. So it doesn't surprise me that it's a component of endurance. Not at all. I don't know if you know the answer to this question, but any best practices of mindfulness as it relates to endurance?
Yeah, I don't think we have answers here, and I know that the researchers I spoke to at UCSD, they have developed a specific, like an athlete-focused mindfulness program, but the basic structure they've been using in the research is very much like the 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction courses that Jon Kabat-Zinn developed in the 1970s. So it's not some sort of obscure or weird form. They're using the classic thing that's available in pretty much any city. I know there are certainly apps out there that promote mindfulness and things like that. I don't have any opinion one way or the other. I don't know whether those work. It would strike me that they may have some value. They probably are not as good as a in-person 8-week session, but there may be somewhere in the middle there.
Okay. Well, let's sum this up then. As an individual that does a lot of things every day, that tests my endurance, both physical and mental, what would you say are the 3 things that I should know about endurance? And if there's a couple of things that I can do to improve my endurance, just as a matter of course, if you could let us know what those are.
Yeah, I would say the biggest and most important message to understand is that when you encounter a limit that feels totally physical and concrete and non-negotiable, in 99.9% of cases, it's actually being dictated by your brain, which doesn't mean it's imaginary, but it means it's negotiable. So that's the first thing to understand, is that limits that feel physical generally aren't. At least at some fundamental level. You also need to understand that perception is, and not to be speaking cliches, but perception is kind of reality. How hard something feels to you is the effort that you perceive is the most important driver of your ability to continue or push harder, and that effort is influenced by all sorts of factors outside of the direct task you're doing. Everything around you is influencing your effort, and that sort of, I think, segues into the things you can do to improve your performance, which is, one is be aware of your external realities. Are you tiring yourself out? Are you mentally? Are you are you approaching tasks when you're mentally fresh? Are you surrounding yourself by people who are helping you rather than hindering you? And the other is to be aware of your internal status. What are you telling yourself? What does your internal monologue say? What is your self-talk saying, and how is that helping or hindering you? So I think those would be the kind of big picture messages to take away from this.
Well, that's fantastic. Anything about endurance that I didn't bring into the conversation that I probably should have?
I think we've covered kind of the meat of the stuff that that I've been looking at. I guess the one thing I would say is that all this stuff can be fun, and if you want to enhance your likelihood of continuing to push your limits, it's to make sure you don't lose sight of why you want to and what's fun about it. And that there's one of the researchers I spoke to said that a lot of people who are successful in endurance sports, in particular, may have some sort of form of benign masochism. That sounds kind of freaky, but what really all he's saying is they've learned to enjoy the struggle. And so I think that's something to keep in mind.
I agree with that. I'm not saying that people learn to love pain per se, but joy in the process, I think, is important. Besides the very well-researched book that you've written on the topic, what other materials, resources would you point people that are interested in this towards?
Yeah, so I'll suggest two books. To me, the model of the best possible sports science book that looks at questions of human performance and it's focused on another aspect or another contentious debate. Instead of sort of mind versus body, it's nature versus nurture. David Epstein's book, The Sports Gene, is one of the greatest books in this area greatest science book, one of the greatest science books of the last decade. That was maybe 4 or 5 years ago. There's another book that came out last year called Peak Performance by Steve Magnus and Brad Stulberg. And what it is, both those guys come from a sports background, but they are taking a lot of the ideas that I talk about in this book, and they're much more explicitly trying to map them onto other areas, creative pursuits and business pursuits, and trying to understand, doing the translation job of understanding how these sorts of ideas map into a business context. So Peak Performance by Magnus and Stulberg is another interesting one.
Yeah, I think that would be pretty helpful for the people that mostly listen to this podcast. Where can people find you or follow you on social media? Do you like people to find you and follow you?
On social media, I don't like people to follow me in real life, but probably the easiest place to find me is on Twitter. My handle is Sweat Science, and whenever I write new articles or whenever I come across interesting new articles on various topics, I post there. I do have a website, alexhutchinson.net, where you can get more information, but Sweat Science on Twitter is probably the best option. Okay,
and no stalkers. Good. Alex, that's it. Thanks very much. I mean, I think this is a really powerful topic, and talking with you based on all of the knowledge that you've accumulated both from practice and from research, being able to summarize it, I think is really valuable, and I really appreciate it. So I want to thank you for coming on.
Well, thanks a lot, Steve. It's been a lot of fun to talk over this stuff.
This has been Intangibles. I'd like to thank Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com for being the sponsor this season and a supportive partner. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, the Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. I'd like to thank VC Careers for their support, and I'd also like to thank Ben Gloway, who's a fantastic sound engineer. It is a privilege to work with him. Find him on Twitter. His handle is @visible_sound. And thank you. Keep an eye out for the next episode. I'm your host, Steve BERG.